The Second World War saw the clash of armies on a scale never before witnessed in human history. Across the globe, from the steppes of Russia to the jungles of the Pacific, millions of soldiers fought and died in a conflict that would reshape the very fabric of the world. Yet amidst the ceaseless thunder of artillery and the mechanized clash of tanks, a unique brand of warfare emerged, one that would strike terror into the hearts of even the most battle-hardened German soldiers: the American mastery of night fighting. Before we jump into the facts, hit follow and like if you want to get smarter and learn crazy stories to impress your friends and family. From the earliest days of America's entry into the war, the U.S. Army recognized the potential of night operations. Amidst the hard lessons of World War I and the rapid evolution of tactics in the interwar period, American military planners sought to develop a force capable of striking the enemy when they were at their most vulnerable, in the dark of night. This documentary will explore the origins, evolution, and impact of American night fighting in World War II. We will trace the doctrinal debates and training innovations that forged the American GI into a formidable night fighter. We will follow these soldiers from the training grounds of Louisiana and England to the front lines of North Africa, Italy, France, and Belgium. Through the eyes of the men who fought these battles, we will experience the terror and exhilaration of combat in the dark. We will hear from veterans like Private John Miller of the 29th Infantry Division, who recalled, "We trained night and day, but mostly night. By the time we shipped out, I think I could have found my way through the Ardennes blindfolded." But this is not just a story of American triumphs. We will also explore the German perspective, the growing realization among Wehrmacht commanders that they were facing a foe who could turn their own tactics against them. We will delve into captured German documents and prisoner interrogations that reveal a mounting dread of American night fighters. The psychological impact of this threat cannot be overstated. As one German officer confessed, "We never knew when they would come, or from where. Every night we lived in fear of the American ghosts." Over the course of this documentary, we will explore in depth the major campaigns and battles where American night fighting left its mark. From the desperate defensive stands in the Kasserine Pass to the audacious airborne assaults of D-Day, from the brutal hedgerow fighting of Normandy to the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge, we will witness how the American GI's mastery of the night helped turn the tide of the war in Europe. But this is more than a mere recounting of battles. It is an exploration of innovation, adaptation, and the indomitable human spirit. We will see how the Americans not only learned to fight in the dark, but to thrive in it. We will marvel at their ingenuity, their courage, and their relentless determination to defeat a formidable foe. Through expert analysis, archival footage, and the powerful testimonies of those who lived it, this documentary will shed light on a largely untold story of World War II. It will challenge our preconceptions about the nature of warfare and remind us of the incredible sacrifices made by the greatest generation. So join us as we embark on a journey into the heart of darkness, as we explore why the Germans came to fear the night, and how the American GY became the master of it. This is the story of the Shadow War, of the battles fought in the dead of night, and of the men who dared to face their fears in the pursuit of victory. This is the story of why the Germans feared facing American infantry at night. To understand the origins of American night fighting doctrine, we must first look back to the hard lessons of World War I. In the trenches of the Western Front, soldiers on all sides quickly learned the perils of daytime assaults against entrenched positions. The advent of machine guns, barbed wire, and quick-firing artillery had rendered traditional infantry tactics all but obsolete. The result was a grinding stalemate, a war of attrition where gains were measured in yards and every inch of ground was paid for in blood. But amidst this carnage, a glimmer of hope emerged. Some units, particularly those from the British Empire and the United States, began to experiment with night raids. These daring assaults, launched under the cover of darkness, allowed small groups of soldiers to penetrate enemy lines, gather intelligence, and sow chaos in the rear areas. While limited in scope, these raids hinted at the potential of night operations to break the deadlock of trench warfare. In the interwar years, as the world's militaries sought to digest the lessons of the Great War, the U.S. Army began to seriously explore the concept of night fighting. At the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia, instructors like Captain George C. Marshall, who would later become the Army Chief of Staff, began to incorporate night training into the curriculum. Soldiers were taught how to navigate by the stars, how to maintain light discipline, and how to communicate silently using hand signals. But it wasn't just the infantry that was interested in night fighting. The Army's tank corps, led by visionaries like Colonel George S. Patton, also saw the potential of night operations. Patton, who had experienced firsthand the limitations of daytime tank assaults during World War I, believed that tanks could be used to spearhead night attacks, exploiting their mobility and firepower to penetrate enemy lines and disrupt their command and control. As the 1930s progressed and the threat of another global conflict loomed, the U.S. Army continued to refine its night-fighting doctrine. Maneuvers in Louisiana and Texas saw entire divisions practicing night movements and mock battles, honing their skills in the dark. New technologies like infrared night vision devices and specialized flashlights began to be developed and tested. But it was the advent of World War II that would truly put American night-fighting doctrine to the test. As the U.S. watched the fall of France and the Low Countries to the Nazi blitzkrieg, it became clear that old ways of fighting would no longer suffice. The German Wehrmacht had perfected the art of combined arms warfare, using tanks, aircraft, and infantry in close coordination to overwhelm their enemies. If the U.S. was to stand a chance against this formidable foe, it would need to adapt and innovate. One area where American planners saw potential was in the realm of night fighting. The Germans, for all their tactical brilliance, had not placed a strong emphasis on night operations. Their doctrine, which relied heavily on close air support and rapid movement, was less effective in the dark. If American forces could master the art of fighting at night, they might just find the chink in the Nazi armor. As the U.S. began to gear up for war, the training of its infantry and night fighting took on a new urgency. At camps across the country, from the swamps of Florida to the deserts of California, soldiers were put through rigorous night exercises. They learned how to move silently, how to set up ambushes, and how to coordinate their actions with tanks and artillery. Special units, like the Army Rangers and the Marine Raiders, were formed with the express purpose of conducting night raids and long-range patrols behind enemy lines. By the time American forces were deployed to North Africa in 1942, they were ready to put their night-fighting skills to the test. The dark, they had learned, could be their greatest ally. As one soldier put it, "We owned the night," and the Germans were about to find out just what that meant. In the coming years, as American troops battled their way across the deserts of Tunisia, the mountains of Italy, and the hedgerows of Normandy, their mastery of night fighting would prove decisive. Time and again, they would catch the Germans off guard, launching daring assaults under the cover of darkness that would leave the enemy reeling. From the legendary exploits of the 82nd Airborne Division on D-Day to the bitter winter fighting of the Battle of the Bulge, American infantry would earn a fearsome reputation as the masters of the night. But this reputation was not won easily. It was forged in the crucible of combat, paid for in blood and sacrifice. As we will see in the coming chapters, the story of American night fighting in World War II is one of ingenuity, courage, and sheer determination in the face of incredible odds. It is a story that deserves to be told, and one that continues to resonate to this day. To transform the concept of night fighting from a theoretical doctrine into a practical reality, the U.S. Army had to fundamentally reshape the way it trained and equipped its soldiers. This was no small task. Fighting at night required a completely different set of skills and mindset than fighting during the day. Soldiers had to learn to operate in an environment where their primary senses of sight and hearing were severely compromised, where the slightest misstep could give away their position to the enemy. The training began in the most unlikely of places, the swamps and forests of Louisiana. It was here, at the newly established Camp Claiborne, that the Army began to experiment with large-scale night exercises in the early 1940s. Entire divisions, like the 3rd Infantry Division and the 82nd Airborne Division, were put through their paces in simulated night battles. Soldiers learned how to navigate by compass and starlight, how to communicate using whispered commands and hand signals, and how to coordinate their movements with other units in the dark. One of the key innovations to come out of these early exercises was the concept of the Night Infiltration Course. This was a specially designed obstacle course that soldiers had to navigate at night, complete with barbed wire, ditches, and simulated enemy positions. The course was designed to test a soldier's ability to move silently and efficiently in the dark, and to build their confidence in their own night-fighting skills. As the war progressed and American forces were deployed overseas, the night training only intensified. In England, units like the 29th Infantry Division and the 101st Airborne Division underwent rigorous night exercises in preparation for the D-Day landings. Soldiers practiced night parachute jumps, night amphibious landings, and night assaults on fortified positions. They learned how to use specialized equipment like the M3 trench knife, which had a blackened blade to prevent reflection, and the M1942 jumpsuit, which was designed to reduce noise during night movements. But it wasn't just the physical skills of night fighting that the Army sought to instill in its soldiers. Equally important was the mental conditioning, the ability to operate in an environment of constant stress and uncertainty. To this end, the Army employed a variety of psychological training methods. Soldiers were subjected to sleep deprivation, simulated artillery barrages, and even live fire exercises at night. The goal was to inoculate them against the fear and disorientation that could come with fighting in the dark. All of this training was put to the test when American forces first encountered the Germans in combat. In the deserts of North Africa, units like the 1st Infantry Division and the 1st Armored Division quickly learned the value of their night fighting skills. During the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American forces were initially thrown back by a powerful German counterattack. But in the days that followed, they regrouped and launched a series of night attacks that caught the Germans off guard. Using their superior night vision equipment and training, American soldiers were able to infiltrate German positions and disrupt their supply lines, ultimately turning the tide of the battle. Similar tactics would be employed in the campaign up the Italian peninsula. In the rugged terrain of the Apennine Mountains, American infantry units like the 36th Infantry Division and the 88th Infantry Division used their night fighting skills to outmaneuver and outflank German defensive positions. During the Battle of San Pietro in December 1943, American soldiers launched a daring night assault on a key German strongpoint, scaling a sheer cliff face in the dark to take the enemy by surprise. But it was in the European theater that American night fighting tactics would truly come into their own. During the Normandy campaign, units like the 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st Airborne Division used their night training to great effect, launching daring pre-dawn assaults on German positions and holding key terrain until reinforcements could arrive. In the dense hedgerows of the Norman countryside, American soldiers used their night fighting skills to infiltrate German lines and launch devastating close-quarters assaults. Perhaps the most famous example of American night fighting prowess came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. As German forces launched a massive counterattack through the Ardennes forest, American units found themselves surrounded and cut off. But rather than surrender, they used their night training to mount a stubborn defense. Under the cover of darkness, American soldiers launched daring raids on German supply lines, ambushed enemy patrols, and even mounted a full-scale night attack on the town of Bastogne, which had been surrounded by German forces. Throughout the war, American soldiers continued to refine and adapt their night fighting tactics. They learned to use new technologies like the M2075mm recoilless rifle, which could be fired at night without revealing the shooter's position, and the M1857mm recoilless rifle, which could be used to take out enemy tanks in the dark. They developed new techniques for night navigation, like using phosphorescent tape to mark trails and using infrared beacons to guide in supply drops. But perhaps the most important innovation of all was the development of specialized night fighting units. In 1943, the Army created the 1st Ranger Battalion, an elite unit that was specifically trained for night raids and long-range patrols behind enemy lines. The Rangers would go on to play a key role in the D-Day landings and the campaign across France, launching daring night assaults on key German positions like the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. Other units, like the 6th Ranger Battalion and the 5,307th Composite Unit, better known as Merrill's Marauders, were also created with the specific purpose of conducting night operations in the Pacific Theater. These units would become legendary for their ability to penetrate deep behind Japanese lines, gathering intelligence and launching devastating raids under the cover of darkness. By the end of the war, American night fighting tactics had become so effective that they were being studied and emulated by militaries around the world. The British Army, in particular, would adopt many of the same techniques and technologies that had been pioneered by the Americans, using them to great effect in campaigns like the Battle of the Scheldt in late 1944. But for all their success, American night fighting tactics were not without their drawbacks. Operating in the dark was inherently risky, and even the best trained soldiers could become disoriented or separated from their units. Friendly fire incidents were a constant danger, as were accidents like tripping over obstacles or falling into ditches. Moreover, the psychological toll of night fighting could be immense. Many soldiers reported feeling a sense of isolation and vulnerability in the dark, a feeling that was only compounded by the constant stress of combat. The eerie silence of the night, punctuated by the sudden burst of gunfire or the scream of a wounded comrade, could be deeply unsettling. Despite these challenges, American soldiers persevered. They learned to embrace the darkness, to use it as a weapon against their enemies. They developed a unique set of skills and tactics that would become the envy of militaries around the world. And in doing so, they helped to turn the tide of the war in Europe and the Pacific. As one soldier put it, we became creatures of the night. We learned to see in the dark, to move in the dark, to fight in the dark, and we used that to our advantage. The Germans never knew what hit them. It was a sentiment that would be echoed by countless American veterans in the years to come. The experience of night fighting had left an indelible mark on their psyches, a mark that would never quite fade away. For them, the night would always be a time of danger and uncertainty, but also a time of opportunity and triumph. And so, as we look back on the history of American night fighting in World War II, we must remember the courage and the skill of the men who made it possible. They were the pioneers of a new kind of warfare, a warfare that would shape the course of the 20th century and beyond. Their legacy lives on to this day in the training and tactics of modern military forces around the world. But more than that, their legacy lives on in the hearts and minds of all those who have ever served their country in uniform. For them, the night will always be a reminder of the sacrifices that have been made and the victories that have been won in the name of freedom and justice. It is a legacy that we must never forget, and one that we must always honor. For in the end, it was the American soldier, fighting in the dark, who helped to bring the light of liberty to a world in darkness. And for that, we owe them a debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid. As American forces began to engage the Germans in combat, they quickly realized that the lessons they had learned in training would need to be adapted to the realities of the battlefield. Nowhere was this more true than in the deserts of North Africa and the mountains of Italy, where the American GY would face some of the toughest fighting of the war. The campaign in North Africa began in November 1942 with the launch of Operation Torch, This was a massive Allied invasion of French North Africa, designed to secure key ports and airfields and to pressure the Germans from the south. The Americans, under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, would play a key role in this campaign, alongside their British and Commonwealth allies. At first, the going was tough. The Americans were inexperienced, and they found themselves up against some of the best troops in the German army, including the legendary Afrika Korps, under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. In early battles like Kasserine Pass, the Americans were pushed back, suffering heavy casualties and losing valuable equipment. But as the campaign progressed, the Americans began to find their footing. They learned to adapt their tactics to the unique challenges of desert warfare, using their superior numbers and logistics to wear down the Germans. And they began to make use of their night fighting training, launching daring raids and ambushes under the cover of darkness. One of the most famous of these raids was carried out by the 1st Ranger Battalion in March 1943. Under the command of Colonel William O. Darby, the Rangers launched a daring night assault on the Italian-held port of Gela in Sicily. Using rubber boats and scaling ladders, they climbed the steep cliffs overlooking the harbor and took the defenders completely by surprise. In a matter of hours, they had secured the port and taken hundreds of prisoners, opening the way for the Allied invasion of Sicily. The success of the Rangers at Gela was a testament to the value of specialized night fighting units, but it was also a testament to the growing skill and confidence of the American GI. As they gained experience in combat, they became increasingly adept at operating in the dark, using the cover of night to their advantage. This skill would be put to the test again and again as the campaign in Italy unfolded. After the fall of Sicily, the Allies launched an invasion of the Italian mainland, hoping to knock Italy out of the war and to pressure the Germans from the south. But the Germans were ready for them, and they had fortified the rugged terrain of the Italian peninsula with a series of formidable defensive lines. The fighting in Italy would be some of the toughest of the war, a grinding battle of attrition that would test the endurance and the courage of the American soldier to the limit. In battles like Monte Cassino and Anzio, the Americans would face some of the most determined resistance they had ever encountered, as the Germans sought to hold on to every inch of ground. But once again, the Americans would rely on their night fighting skills to give them an edge. In the rugged terrain of the Apennine Mountains, where the Germans had established elaborate defensive positions, the Americans used the cover of darkness to infiltrate behind enemy lines and launch surprise attacks. They made use of specialized equipment like the M3 trench knife and the M1942 jumpsuit, which had been designed specifically for night operations. One of the most remarkable examples of American night fighting in Italy came during the Battle of San Pietro in December 1943. This was a small but strategically important village that the Germans had turned into a fortress, with machine gun nests and artillery positions covering every approach. The Americans had already tried and failed to take the village several times, suffering heavy casualties in the process. But on the night of December 15th, a small group of American soldiers from the 36th Infantry Division decided to try a different approach. Led by a young lieutenant named Vernon Bailey, they made their way through the rugged terrain under the cover of darkness, using ropes and ladders to scale the steep cliffs that overlooked the village. Once they reached the top, they launched a surprise attack on the German positions, catching the defenders completely off guard. The fighting was brutal in close quarters, with the Americans using grenades and bayonets to clear out the German machine gun nests. But by dawn, they had secured the village, opening the way for the rest of the division to advance. The attack on San Pietro became a legend in the annals of American military history, a testament to the skill and the bravery of the American soldier. Similar feats of night fighting would be repeated throughout the Italian campaign, as the Americans continued to push north towards Rome. In battles like Monte Cassino and Anzio, they would face some of the toughest fighting of the war, as the Germans sought to hold on to every inch of ground. But through it all, the Americans would rely on their night fighting skills to give them an edge, launching daring raids and surprise attacks that would keep the enemy off balance. By the time the Allies finally entered Rome on June 4, 1944, the American GI had become a seasoned veteran of night fighting. They had learned to operate in the dark, to use the terrain to their advantage, and to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. They had become, in the words of one German prisoner, the ghosts of the night, the shadows that haunted our dreams. But the campaign in Italy was just a prelude to the even greater challenges that lay ahead. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, they knew that they would need every ounce of their night-fighting skill and courage to succeed. The Germans had fortified the French coast with a formidable array of defenses, and they were determined to hold on to their conquest at all costs. It would be up to the American G1er once again to lead the way. And as they prepared for the greatest battle of their lives, they drew strength from the lessons they had learned in North Africa and Italy, from the bonds of brotherhood they had forged in the heat of battle, and from the knowledge that they were fighting for a cause that was greater than themselves. As one soldier put it, "We had been through hell in Italy, and we knew that France would be even worse. But we also knew that we had each other, and that we had the skills and the courage to see it through. We were ready for whatever the Germans could throw at us." It was a sentiment that would be put to the ultimate test on the beaches of Normandy and in the hedgerows and forests of France. But for the American GWII, there was no turning back. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to falter now. They would fight on, through the darkness and the fear, until the job was done. As dawn broke over the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the American GI faced the greatest challenge of their lives. This was D-Day, the long-awaited invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, and the fate of the free world hung in the balance. The Germans had fortified the French coast with a formidable array of defenses, from concrete bunkers and machine gun nests to minefields and barbed wire. They were determined to hold on to their conquest at all costs, and they had vowed to fight to the last man. But the Americans were ready for them. They had trained for this moment for years, honing their skills in the deserts of North Africa and the mountains of Italy. They had learned to operate in the dark, to use the terrain to their advantage, and to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. And now, as they waded ashore under a hail of gunfire and artillery, they put all of those skills to the test. The fighting on the beaches was brutal and bloody, with the Americans suffering heavy casualties as they struggled to gain a foothold. But through sheer grit and determination, they managed to push inland, securing key objectives like the Pointe du Hoc and the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. And as the day wore on, they were joined by thousands of their comrades, who poured ashore in a seemingly endless stream of men and machines. But the real test would come in the days and weeks that followed, as the Americans sought to break out of their beachhead and push deeper into France. The Germans had fortified the countryside with a maze of hedgerows and strong points, and they were determined to make the Americans pay for every inch of ground. It was here, in the close quarters fighting of the Norman countryside, that the American GI would once again rely on their night fighting skills to give them an edge. The hedgerows were a nightmare for conventional warfare, with their thick walls of earth and vegetation providing cover for German machine guns and snipers. But at night, the Americans could use the darkness to their advantage, slipping through the gaps and launching surprise attacks on enemy positions. One of the most famous examples of this kind of night fighting came during the Battle of Bloody Gulch, a small but ferocious engagement that took place on the night of June 13, 1944. A company of American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division had become separated from their unit and were surrounded by German forces in a narrow ravine. Outnumbered and outgunned, they seemed doomed to be wiped out. But as night fell, the Americans decided to launch a daring breakout attempt. Using the cover of darkness, they slipped past the German lines and made their way to a nearby hill, where they dug in and prepared to fight to the last man. The Germans, sensing victory, launched a massive assault on the American position, But the paratroopers held their ground, fighting off wave after wave of attackers with grenades and bayonets. By dawn, the hill was littered with German dead, and the Americans had managed to hold out against impossible odds. The Battle of Bloody Gulch became a legend in the annals of the 101st Airborne, a testament to the skill and the bravery of the American soldier. Similar feats of night fighting would be repeated throughout the Normandy campaign as the Americans continued to push deeper into France. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, they launched daring night raids on German supply lines and communication centers, disrupting the enemy's ability to coordinate their defenses. And in the towns and villages of Normandy, they engaged in brutal house-to-house fighting, using the cover of darkness to clear out German strongpoints one by one. But the Germans were far from beaten, and they had one last card to play. In December 1944, they launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split the Allied forces in half and drive them back to the sea. This was the Battle of the Bulge, one of the largest and most brutal engagements of the entire war. Once again, the American GI found themselves in the thick of the fighting, struggling to hold the line against a determined enemy. The weather was bitterly cold, with heavy snow and fog, making visibility almost impossible. And the Germans had managed to achieve almost complete surprise, catching the Americans off guard and pushing them back in several key sectors. But even in the darkest days of the battle, the American soldier refused to give up. They dug in and fought with a tenacity and a courage that would become legendary, holding out against impossible odds and buying time for reinforcements to arrive. And when those reinforcements did arrive, in the form of General George S. Patton's Third Army, they launched a devastating counterattack that would turn the tide of the battle and push the Germans back to their starting positions. Throughout the Battle of the Bulge, the American GY relied on their night fighting skills to give them an edge. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, they used the cover of darkness to infiltrate German lines and launch surprise attacks on enemy positions. They made use of specialized equipment like the M1 carbine, which was lighter and more maneuverable than the standard M1 Garand rifle, and the M3 trench knife, which was designed specifically for close-quarters combat. One of the most remarkable examples of American night fighting during the Battle of the Bulge came on the night of December 16, 1944, when a small group of American soldiers from the 28th Infantry Division found themselves surrounded by German forces near the town of Wiltz, Luxembourg. Outnumbered and outgunned, they seemed doomed to be wiped out. But as night fell, the Americans decided to launch a daring escape attempt. Using the cover of darkness, they slipped past the German lines and made their way to a nearby forest where they took shelter and waited for daylight. The Germans, assuming that the Americans had been wiped out, moved on to other targets, allowing the small group of soldiers to eventually make their way back to friendly lines. Stories like this one would be repeated throughout the Battle of the Bulge, as American soldiers used their night fighting skills to survive and fight another day. And when the battle was finally over, and the Germans had been pushed back to their starting positions, the American G1 emerged as the undisputed masters of the night. In the months that followed, as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany and the end of the war drew near, the American soldier continued to rely on their night fighting skills to give them an edge. They launched daring raids behind enemy lines, disrupting German supply lines and communications, and they engaged in brutal house-to-house fighting in the towns and cities of Germany. But even as the war drew to a close, the American GI never forgot the lessons they had learned in the darkness of Normandy and the Ardennes. They had become a different kind of soldier, one who could fight and win in any conditions, against any odds. And they had earned the respect and the fear of their enemies, who had come to dread the sound of American boots in the night. As one German soldier put it, "We could hear them coming, but we could never see them. They were like ghosts, moving through the darkness with a skill and a speed that was almost supernatural. And when they struck with a fury that was impossible to match. It was a testament to the skill and the bravery of the American soldier, and to the enduring legacy of their night-fighting prowess. And it was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for those who are willing to fight for what they believe in. As the war in Europe drew to a close, the American GY could look back on a campaign that had tested them to the limit, but which they had ultimately won. They had faced the might of the German war machine, and they had emerged victorious, thanks in no small part to their mastery of night fighting. But even as they celebrated their victory, they knew that the world had changed forever. The old ways of warfare, with their rigid formations and their reliance on brute force, had given way to a new kind of fighting, one that valued stealth, speed, and cunning. And the American soldier had been at the forefront of that change, adapting and innovating in the face of impossible odds. It was a legacy that would endure long after the guns had fallen silent, and one that would shape the course of history for generations to come. And for the men who had fought and died in the darkness of Normandy and the Ardennes, it was a legacy that would never be forgotten. As one veteran of the Normandy campaign put it, "We went in as boys, but we came out as men, and we came out as something more than that. We came out as soldiers, in the truest sense of the word. We had learned to fight, and to win, no matter what the cost. And that is a lesson that will stay with us for the rest of our lives." As the American GIS were honing their night-fighting skills and preparing for the invasion of Europe, the German army was facing a crisis of its own. After years of almost uninterrupted victory, they found themselves on the defensive, struggling to hold back the tide of Allied forces that threatened to overwhelm them. At first, the Germans were dismissive of the American soldier. They had heard stories of the soft, undisciplined Americans who lacked the training and the toughness of their own battle-hardened troops. They believed that the Americans would quickly fold under the pressure of real combat, and that the war would soon be over. But as the fighting in North Africa and Italy began to intensify, the Germans began to realize that they had badly underestimated their new enemy. The Americans, while inexperienced at first, proved to be quick learners, adapting their tactics and their equipment to the demands of modern warfare. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the realm of night fighting. As the Germans soon discovered, the Americans had a special aptitude for operating in the dark, using the cover of night to launch daring raids and surprise attacks that caught them completely off guard. At first, the Germans tried to dismiss these night attacks as mere annoyances, the work of small, isolated units that posed no real threat to their overall position. But as the frequency and the intensity of the attacks began to increase, they were forced to take notice. German officers began to report a growing sense of unease among their men, a fear that the Americans could strike at any time, from any direction. They spoke of the eerie silence of the night, broken only by the sudden burst of gunfire or the explosion of a grenade. And they spoke of the ghostly figures that seemed to materialize out of the darkness, striking with a speed and a ferocity that was almost inhuman. As the war progressed, the Germans began to develop a grudging respect for the American soldier, and for their mastery of night fighting in particular. They marveled at the Americans' ability to navigate through the darkness, using only the stars and the terrain to guide them. And they were impressed by the Americans' use of specialized equipment, like the M3 trench knife and the M1 carbine, which seemed to be tailor-made for close-quarters combat in the dark. But even as they began to appreciate the American skills, the Germans also began to fear them. They knew that the Americans were not content to simply hold their ground, but were always looking for ways to take the fight to the enemy. And they knew that, in the darkness of the night, the Americans held a distinct advantage. This fear began to manifest itself in a number of ways. German soldiers began to report strange noises in the night, the sound of footsteps or the rustling of leaves that seemed to come from nowhere. They spoke of shadows that moved on their own, and of the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes. Some even began to whisper of the night ghosts, the legendary American soldiers who could move through the darkness like phantoms. striking without warning and disappearing just as quickly. These stories spread like wildfire through the German ranks, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and dread that began to eat away at their morale. As the war entered its final stages, the Germans found themselves in an increasingly desperate position. They were being pushed back on all fronts, their once mighty war machine crumbling under the relentless pressure of the Allied advance. And everywhere they turned, they seemed to find the Americans waiting for them, ready to strike from the shadows. In the Ardennes forest, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans launched a massive counteroffensive in a last-ditch attempt to turn the tide of the war. But even here, in the depths of the winter cold, they found themselves haunted by the specter of the American night fighter. German soldiers reported seeing strange lights in the forest, the flickering of a cigarette, or the glow of a flashlight that seemed to beckon them forward, only to lure them into a deadly trap. They spoke of the sound of American voices, whispering in the darkness, taunting them and mocking their efforts to break through the Allied lines. And when the battle was over, and the Germans had been pushed back to their starting positions, they knew that they had been beaten not just by the strength of American arms, but by the skill and the cunning of the American soldier. In the end, the German fear of the American night fighter became a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. The more they feared the Americans, the more they began to doubt themselves, and the more they began to make mistakes. And as the mistakes began to pile up, the Americans were always there to take advantage, launching ever bolder attacks and pushing the Germans back further and further. As one German officer put it, we could feel them out there watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when they did strike, it was with a fury that was impossible to match. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, materializing out of the darkness like ghosts, and then disappearing just as quickly. It was like fighting a shadow that could kill. It was a sentiment that would be echoed by many German soldiers in the years to come, as they looked back on their experiences fighting the Americans in the dark. They spoke of the fear and the uncertainty that came with facing an enemy who seemed to thrive in the shadows, and of the toll that this fear had taken on their own morale and effectiveness. But they also spoke of a grudging respect for the American soldier, and for the skill and the bravery that they had shown in the face of impossible odds. They knew that they had been beaten by a worthy opponent, one who had adapted and innovated in ways that they had never thought possible. And as the world began to rebuild in the aftermath of the war, the legend of the American night fighter would only grow, becoming a symbol of the indomitable spirit and the unbreakable will of the American people. For the German soldier, the American GI would always be a source of both fear and fascination, a reminder of the skill and the courage that had been brought to bear against them in the darkest days of the war. And for the American soldier, the experience of fighting in the night would be a badge of honor, a testament to their own resilience and adaptability in the face of unimaginable adversity. As one American veteran put it, "We went into the night as ordinary men, but we came out as something more. We came out as soldiers, in the truest sense of the word. And we came out with a bond that would last a lifetime, forged in the heat of battle and tempered in the cool of the night. It was a bond that would endure long after the guns had fallen silent, and one that would forever mark the American GI as a force to be reckoned with, in the darkness and in the light." As the Second World War came to a close, the American GI emerged as a symbol of hope and freedom for people around the world. They had faced down the greatest threat to democracy in modern history, and they had emerged victorious, thanks in no small part to their mastery of night fighting. But the legacy of the American night fighter would extend far beyond the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. In the years that followed, the tactics and the techniques that had been pioneered by the American GY would be studied and adapted by militaries around the world, becoming a standard part of modern warfare. Today, night fighting is an essential part of military training and doctrine, with soldiers and units around the world practicing the same skills and using the same equipment that were first developed by the American GUI more than 75 years ago. But the legacy of the American night fighter is about more than just tactics and equipment. It is about the spirit and the values that drove them to fight and to win against impossible odds. The American GI who fought in the darkness of Normandy and the Ardennes, who endured the bitter cold and the biting winds of the European winter, did so not for glory or for fame, but for a cause that they believed in. They fought for freedom, for justice, and for the right of all people to live in peace and security. And in doing so, they set an example that would inspire generations to come. They showed that ordinary men and women, when called upon to do extraordinary things, could rise to the challenge and achieve the impossible. Today, as we look back on the legacy of the American night fighter, we are reminded of the sacrifices that were made and the courage that was shown by those who came before us. We are reminded of the power of the human spirit and of the unbreakable bond that unites all those who have served their country in uniform. And we are reminded of the enduring values that have always been at the heart of the American experience, the values of freedom, of justice, and of the inherent dignity and worth of every human being. These are the values that the American GI fought for, in the darkness and in the light. And these are the values that continue to inspire us today as we strive to build a world that is more just, more peaceful, and more free. As we honor the memory of the American night fighter, let us also honor the values that they fought for and the legacy that they left behind. Let us remember their courage, their sacrifice, and their unwavering commitment to the cause of freedom. And let us carry that legacy forward into the future as we work to build a world that is worthy of their example and of the ideals that they fought and died for. For the American GY, the experience of fighting in the night was a defining moment in their lives, one that would stay with them forever. It was a moment of terror and triumph, of fear and courage, of desperation and hope. But it was also a moment of unity, of shared purpose and shared sacrifice. In the darkness of the night, the American GI found a strength and a resilience that they never knew they had. They found a bond with their fellow soldiers that would last a lifetime, forged in the heat of battle and tempered in the cool of the night. And they found a sense of purpose, a reason to fight and to endure, that would sustain them through the darkest days of the war and beyond. Today, as we remember the American night fighter, we are reminded of the power of that unity and of the strength that comes from standing together in the face of adversity. We are reminded that even in the darkest of times there is always hope, always the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. And we are reminded that, as long as there are those who are willing to fight for what they believe in, as long as there are those who are willing to stand up for what is right, the flame of freedom will never be extinguished. This is the legacy of the American night fighter, and it is a legacy that will endure for generations to come. It is a legacy of courage, of sacrifice, and of unbreakable spirit. And it is a legacy that calls us to action, to take up the mantle of those who came before us, and to fight for a world that is more just, more peaceful, and more free. As we honor the memory of the American GY, let us also honor the values that they fought for and the legacy that they left behind. Let us strive to be worthy of their example and to carry their legacy forward into the future. For in the end, it is not the darkness that defines us, but the light that we bring into the world. And it is in that light that we will find our greatest strength, our greatest hope, and our greatest victory.